Hello, I'm Sumi Somaskanda. From the BBC World Service, this is The Global Story. U.S. foreign policy has been dominated this election year by Israel's fight against Hamas and its allies across the region. The attacks of October 7th last year, the scale of human suffering in Gaza, and now the spiraling violence in Lebanon have weighed heavily on America's international outlook and its politics at home. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have said they want to bring peace and security to the Middle East.
President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends.
And I will end the chaos in the Middle East, and I will prevent World War III, something I can do that nobody else is going to be able to do. I know them all.
What is less clear is how or whether either of them can do it if elected president. So what do we know about the candidates' plans for the Middle East? Could frustration with the conflict sway U.S. voters? And what impact does the election have on people in Jerusalem, Gaza, Beirut, and beyond? With me today is the BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen, in Jerusalem. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, how are you? How are you today?
Great, thank you, Jeremy. And our North America correspondent, Neda Tawfik, who is in New York. Hey, Neda.
Hi, great to be with you both.
Jeremy, I want to start with you because the Israel-Gaza conflict has really loomed over the presidential election here in the U.S. Now there is the expansion of fighting to Lebanon, significant fighting in Lebanon as well. For Vice President Kamala Harris and the current administration, how do you think this added factor changes things going into the vote?
Well, that's a big question, really. I don't think we'll know till we get the results of what happens on November the 5th. It's been a truism for, many elections in America that you don't put pressure on Israel before an election. And they've been trying to follow that rule, I'd say. But of course, things are changing in America demographically in terms of the politics of the way that people want to vote, and in crucial states, Michigan notably, where an Arab American vote is a very important factor in all of that. I think there are concerns they might lose votes, but we will see when the results come in.
Neda, you talked to Donald Trump actually about the spiraling violence in Lebanon. What did he tell you?
Yeah, well, this was back in September 26th at Trump Tower. He was giving a press conference, but right across town, Sumi, the UN General Assembly was taking place. And just as diplomats were gathering there, it was clear that Lebanon was on the brink. The Secretary General was warning that Lebanon could not become another Gaza.
Look no further than Lebanon. We should all be alarmed by the escalation.
I wanted to kind of hear from Donald Trump specifically what he would do differently in the Middle East.
On Lebanon, leaders yesterday at the UN General Assembly came together to call for an immediate ceasefire. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is speaking at the UN tomorrow. He has refused to do that. What would you do differently to prevent the Middle East fire?
You have to have that ended one way or the other. The world isn't going to take it. You have to have that ended, and I would think that we're getting close to a point where maybe it can end pretty soon. But you're going to have to end. That's unacceptable. The whole thing over there is unacceptable. That's another one. October 7th would have never happened. Would have never happened.
He didn't really get into specifics, Sumi. He's really strayed away on this campaign from talking about specifics, hoping it'll hurt the Democrats instead, who are obviously in power right now.
That's really interesting, Neda. Before we dive deeper into the conflict and what it means for this election, what the candidates are saying, I want to take a step back. When and why did the U.S. become so concerned with what goes on in the Middle East?
Well, let's start with one word: oil. And long, long ago, in the days before the US was self-sufficient in oil, they relied very much on imports from there. But, as the years went by, after the Second World War, they became a global power with global interests. And there were all kinds of things that they were interested in terms of trying to have friends in the area, to wield their power. The US was the first country to recognize an independent Israel in 1948. And then once the Cold War got going, the Middle East became one of the theaters of conflict between the superpowers. The Soviet Union had its favorites. The Americans had their favorites, and a pattern developed of interfering in the region, generally speaking, I would say, not to the benefit of the people in the region, which really continues to this day. And actually, if you talk to people in the in the region, I'm sitting talking to you in Jerusalem, where there are Palestinians and Israelis in Jerusalem, and often people say to you here, well, why on earth do people around the world take such an interest in this actually relatively small area? I think a lot of cultural, historic, economic forces, in fact, come together and always have done in this part of the world. And it really is a kind of global crossroads. And of course, you can't as well take away the influence of religion. And a lot of people who, even if they've never been here for religious or cultural reasons, feel they have some kind of a stake in what goes on. So the US actually in recent times as well, going back to President Obama, have fantasized about pivoting away from the Middle East and going to places that matter more for modern America, like the Asia-Pacific area, concentrating on China. Unfortunately, the Middle East has got this terrible habit of pulling people back in.
Neda, against that backdrop, what is your sense? How much of a priority is the Middle East in Washington right now?
Well, as Jeremy said, now they've been dragged back into the Middle East. I mean, Biden came in, remember, in 2020, promising to end the forever wars in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. He wanted to focus on domestic issues, as you both said, pivot to Asia. And if you look at what's happening, days into his first term, he did resume contact with Palestinian leaders. He restored aid funding, but he didn't reverse some of the controversial Trump-era moves. And there was no real effort to restart peace talks. Instead, the Biden administration really tried to focus on brokering a deal to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, trying to follow up from the Abraham Accords that were kind of started under Donald Trump. And Palestinians saw that as a betrayal from Arab nations who, they thought wouldn't accept recognition of Israel in relations until they themselves, Palestinians, had peace. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman now says they won't recognize Israel without the establishment of a Palestinian state. So that has been affected. And on Iran, let's not forget that Biden was the vice president when the Iran nuclear deal was signed. He promised to rejoin the deal after Donald Trump had pulled the United States out of it. But in the end, though, he kept Donald Trump's sanctions in place while negotiations kind of went nowhere for months. And there are now huge obstacles in the way of an Iran deal while Iran gets closer to perhaps having a nuclear weapon.
Jeremy, if you look at what is happening on the ground since October 7th, we've seen President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris trying to temper Israel's actions in Gaza, to broker a ceasefire agreement that would lead to a hostage release deal as well. We have seen, however, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ignore some of the red lines that the Biden administration has laid out. And, I've spoken to lawmakers here in Washington, Democrats who have said they think the Israeli Prime Minister has even humiliated President Biden. Do you think this is a sign that U.S. influence is weakening?
Undoubtedly. This last year for U.S. foreign policy, I'd say, and U.S. standing in the world, has been pretty disastrous insofar as their weakness regarding Israel has been shown up. Because if you think back to just after the 7th of October attacks, Joe Biden came over here and he said things like, we support you 100%, but he said something like, don't be like we were in the U.S. after 9/11, don't be blinded by rage.
But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
He has said repeatedly, and so has Secretary of State Blinken, that they should not kill so many Palestinian civilians, that they should respect the laws of war, that they should allow in humanitarian aid. And while they have gone, yes, admittedly, definitely, American influence has meant the Israelis have gone from allowing nothing in to start with, when the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said we are dealing with human animals and we will treat them accordingly, and nothing will go into the Gaza Strip. Well, there has been an aid operation, but it's still absolutely less than a minimum that people need. And I think that it's quite clear that Joe Biden has an image of Israel in his head. He's someone who has, I think, a romantic attachment to Israel. And I think that in particularly the last 6 months or so, he has been, and this is not just my analysis, these similar thoughts have been shared to me by very senior diplomatic sources among Israel's allies, that effectively he's been played. They know effectively that whatever they do, the Americans will continue to support them. How do they know that? It's because there are two potential big levers the Americans could have used. One is diplomatic support at the United Nations and also arms supplies. Now, I know the American position is effectively that Israel is an ally. They will continue those arms supplies. Had they not allowed those arms supplies to keep on coming in, Israel's enemies like Iran would be energized. It could have resulted in a much worse war. But, for a lot of people around the world, and I'm talking people often in mainstream European capitals as well as, if you like, this area that's known as the Global South, it seems to be really quite hypocritical. The Americans speak a lot about the importance of the rules-based international order. It's a phrase that Secretary Blinken uses repeatedly, but a lot of people around the world have looked at the way America has behaved, and they've thought rules-based international order, actually, it's our rules, it's our order, they apply to our friends if we choose that they will, and we'll treat other countries differently. Now, this actually should come as no surprise, because that's how big, powerful nations tend to work. They're not consistent. But I think for a lot of people around the world, it's been particularly egregious.
Neda, given what Jeremy's describing, this weakening U.S. influence, certainly over the last year, what are we seeing from Kamala Harris? What is she saying that she would possibly do differently than Joe Biden?
Well, Sumi, in the beginning, when she became the nominee, everyone was watching to see if there would be a switch. You think back to July when the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited. She actually did not attend his speech in Congress. She said she had another prior commitment. She did meet with him privately. And after that, she came out and said that she would not be silent about the suffering in Gaza.
What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
And so for a while, it did feel as though her rhetoric kind of was more nuanced, was really nodding to the suffering of Palestinians in a way that those who were upset with the administration hadn't seen from Joe Biden. And you fast forward to the Democratic National Convention, and I think a real hit for her was when a Palestinian American wasn't allowed to address the hall, even though the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who was one of the hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th, did speak.
In an inflamed Middle East, we know the one thing that can most immediately release pressure and bring calm to the entire region: a deal that brings this diverse group of 109 hostages home and ends the suffering of the innocent civilians in Gaza.
And even community leaders that had supported Harris there said that it was going to be hard for them to explain to Arab Americans that decision. It's really hard to see her being different in any real concrete way from Joe Biden right now. I mean, she has said she won't change the U.S. policy on arming Israel. She's given no sign that she's going to have a major break from kind of the mainstream Democratic position. So she's repeated policy about wanting to end the war as soon as possible, such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends. She wants more aid in, international humanitarian law respected, and of course, still nodding to the fact of U.S. policy for Palestinians to get their freedom and self-determination.
Neda, earlier we were speaking about Donald Trump's answer to your question when you asked him about Israel's expanding battle against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Do we know what his approach to Israel would be if he were to return to the White House?
Well, look, we have to remember that the base of his party, evangelicals, he cares deeply about what they think, and they are very tied to Israel for religious reasons. He did speak to El Arabiya recently, and he said he thinks negotiations are possible, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would listen to him. But if you've looked at his other kind of rhetoric in the past, he has ridiculed Kamala Harris's ceasefire calls. He said it would be a constraint on Israel.
If we continue down our current path with 4 more years of Kamala, Israel will be faced not just with an attack, but with total annihilation. And I hate to say it so much.
We know, based on his previous record as president, he was the most pro-Israel president in history.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
And he's also cast doubt in the past about the viability of a two-state solution. So there are those who fear another Trump presidency would mean that Israel would be allowed to annex more land, whether in Gaza or the West Bank.
Jeremy, what do you think? What did the first term of Donald Trump's presidency tell us about what he would mean for Israel in the Middle East?
I mean, he was essentially giving the Israelis a buffet of goods, all that they wanted. He cut off aid to UNRWA, the UN agency, which Israel is at this point viscerally opposed to, causing actually a lot of suffering among Palestinians. He pushed the Abraham Accords, which were these deals with various Arab countries, the most prominent of which is the United Arab Emirates, with mutual recognition.
In a few moments, these visionary leaders will sign the first 2 peace deals between Israel and the Arab state in more than a quarter century.
Which essentially was a fairly cost-free win for the Israelis. They didn't have to give up anything to get those deals because President Trump gave the other side of the deal, the Arab side, various things that they were after. I was actually in the White House the day that they signed the so-called deal of the century, which was his attempt at making Middle East peace, something that his son-in-law Jared Kushner had pushed. And it was an agreement which had almost the shortest journey from being signed to the dustbin of history of any international agreement, because in negotiating that, they didn't actually talk to the Palestinians. They just suggested a solution to them and tried to essentially bribe them with promises, not real money, but promises of money to give up their national aspirations. And I just thought, this is like a bubble of fantasy, because it's not actually dealing with you can't make a deal without talking to both sides, and he didn't do that. So that didn't go anywhere. And probably, perhaps most egregiously of all, the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear agreement, not a perfect agreement at all, but probably the biggest single foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration, which may well be why Trump was so anxious to get rid of it. But at the behest particularly of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, the Americans pulled out of it. At the time that they pulled out of the JCPOA, the Iranians were actually, they were in accordance with its rules in terms of the enrichment of uranium. And it was only after that happened that they started upping their enrichment of uranium and their stockpile, getting them to the place where they are now, where most observers would say that if they took the decision to do it, they would be in a position in fairly quick time to be able to make some kind of nuclear weapon. So I think you can point to loads of things and say that the things that he didn't work out. So he seemed to be pretty interested in the Middle East and pretty interested in helping Israel, but I don't think he did much for regional security at all.
Jeremy, how much of a consideration is this for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu? We know that he is, of course, as many world leaders are, watching the election closely. Does he have a preferred candidate, do you think?
I mean, you can argue that he's pretty much got the Biden administration where he wants it. Would a Harris administration be all that different? Well, we've already discussed that, and the answer is probably not massively. Trump gave Netanyahu pretty much what he wanted last time round, so I think he's feeling pretty comfortable as far as America's concerned. Neither candidate for him would be a disaster.
Jeremy, what about people in Jerusalem or Beirut or Gaza, for that matter? How do you think they are looking at this election and what impact it could have on them?
Well, it depends who they are, because this is a very diverse area with different groups. Jewish Israelis, 80% of the population, absolutely appreciate the support they get from the United States. I'd say on the other side, those who are actually on the wrong end of American-supplied weapon systems have extremely negative views about the United States, about the way that it supports Israel, about the way that, from their perspective, it turns a blind eye to what, the evidence that is piling up of massive human rights violations.
One more question to both of you. Do you think this election could be a turning point for U.S. policy in the Middle East? Netta, starting with you.
We see that both candidates are largely going to maintain the same policy, if perhaps Donald Trump would take a much stronger approach. But I think what's really interesting is how Iran fits into all of this. Some are looking to see if Donald Trump wins, for example, who would he be appointing? What approach would the administration take? Because Donald Trump and Republicans have arguably more Iran hawks in their party. We have seen them, the likes of Senator Tom Cotton, pushing for more aggressive action now against Iran. And with the situation already so volatile, I hear it from the UN all the time, Sumi, the warnings from the Secretary General, from diplomats about the risk of miscalculation. I mean, we're quite frankly already seeing that, but they're worried about just how much worse it could get. And if we do see an administration with a much more aggressive approach to Iran versus what we've seen with Joe Biden and Iran both reiterating that they don't want war, I think that is certainly one factor that this election could influence.
Well, I actually agree with what Nada was just saying about Iran. I mean, that is the crucial factor where that unfolding crisis fits in. The fact is, the Americans are not in control of events in the region. They are responding to events. They are players insofar as they support Israel on a very, very deep and very tangible level. But in terms of being, if you like, the masters of a region where they can pull the strings and things happen, well, that's not the case. What we've seen in the last 12 months has actually been American lack of influence. They have managed to to add their weight to trying to stop the war getting even worse than it has. But let's look at the situation at the moment. There are appalling things going on right now in Gaza. You can easily argue that the Israelis have achieved their war aims of pretty much destroying Hamas, making sure they can't do a 7th of October again. However, they're pushing very, very hard, pushing out remaining civilians in northern Gaza. There's a serious war going on in Lebanon. There is unrest throughout the region. So I think, the big challenge for the next American president, whoever it is, will be, first off, let's try not to make things any worse. Let's try and keep a lid on it. And they're certainly not going to be able to pivot away from the region because they are intimately involved in what's going on without being able to control what's going on. And that's not a great place for the most powerful country in the world to be.
Jeremy, Netta, thank you both so much for that conversation. Really interesting.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
If you want more episodes of The Global Story, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Every day, we dive deep into a single story and bring you in-depth analysis from our correspondents around the world. Subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching The Global Story.